we have a panel here especially chosen because they have the facts and the opinions at their fingertips. So I think the best thing to do is start, Simon, if I could, with you. You were talking the other day at the British Game Alliance, it is on. You were talking the other day at the British Game Alliance launch on this subject. Now, the British Game Alliance is a wonderful opportunity to sell the birds on that we shoot. But one of the phrases you used was, unless we regulate ourselves on this matter, we're going to have the weight of law crashing down on top of us.
Thanks, Charlie. It wasn't on this matter, in fact, because I think I can say with certainty that in all of the years that I've been doing this, particularly in Parliament, on the receiving end of lobby groups, individuals, constituents, opinions from just about everybody, nobody has ever once mentioned bag size as an issue. They've often mentioned the ethics of shooting, they've often mentioned concerns they have over sustainability and all that, but nobody has ever said there is a magic number below which shooting is acceptable and above which it isn't. And I think the danger for us, and you know, we hear it on sort of shoot days around the lunch table, is this theory that big is always bad and small is always good. All of us in this room could probably point to some small shoots whose standards fall possibly short, particularly in the treatment of dead game, is where they should be, and some big shoots which actually do a fantastic job, are very sustainable ecologically, economically, and the like. And so I think we have to be really careful about creating an argument which doesn't actually exist in the minds of the public.
So you're pro big bag days?
I'm pro sustainability. And I think I've been on many days, was room for more, of course, many days where there, it would be arguable that it's a big bag, but it's done really well. And I can tell you, you know, if Chris Packham or Mark Avery was listening to this, they wouldn't be remotely concerned if we shot more than 2. If we shot 1, that is enough for them to froth at the mouth and complain. So that is not where the issue lies. The issue lies in consuming game properly, looking after it, dealing with it properly, and having shoots which are sustainable in terms of the environment in which they're operating. That's key.
Can we do a very quick straw poll in the audience, please? If you think big bag days, so if you think a 500 plus day is absolutely fine, I'm going to ask you to lift your hand up in the air. If you think it is absolutely not fine, I'm going to ask you to lift your hand up in the air. And if you have no views either way, you can keep your hands down. So who here thinks a 500 plus day is absolutely fine? So a good showing. Who here thinks it is absolutely not fine? Not that far off, half and half. Patrick, I think you are a natural one duck man, a non-big bag shooter. Is that fair to say?
I think probably I am a one duck man. There are often many more ducks, but I often only go home with one due to my shooting. But I think, so we did a poll the other day on Twitter asking our readers what they thought of big bags, whether they supported big bags or didn't. And 75% came out saying that they thought there was a problem with big bags. And I think fundamentally in terms of PR, we would all agree at the moment that there isn't a demand for the game that we're shooting, for all the game that we're shooting. So to carry on...
Really? I mean, I thought the whole point of the BGA was that they have found demand and they've sold...
No. The BGA is trying to find demand, but at this moment in time, there isn't the demand. They're trying to foster demand. So to carry on shooting 500 bird days is a terrible PR move. And I think we all pretend, or many of us pretend, that to shoot one bird is you know, a horrible thing to the person in the street who doesn't like shooting, in the same way that shooting 500 birds is a horrible thing. And that's just simply not the case. There are many people you speak to who say, I'd happily go out and shoot a rabbit and take it home for supper. And then you say, how about going out and shooting 500 birds and you don't know where they're going? And they say, that sounds awful. That's just the truth.
Mark, you let a lot of big days like this.
Actually, no, we don't. And I have fairly controversial views, as I do on most things, about bag sizes. But this is such a muddle. What Simon said, I agree with completely. What Patrick said, and then look at the audience, sorry, but it's a muddle, guys. I mean, the idea that 500 is bad and 475 is good, and Christopher's there putting his hand up with big bags, is just ridiculous. We need to get some perspective. I personally, I don't think, actually, this season we've got a single 500 plus bird day. Have I been on
because the grouse counts are down? Are you talking about
pheasants as well? So, but And in fact, the majority of demand is actually, in our market, is for 200 to 300 birds a day. So 150 probably at the lower end of the letting market, at 350 at the bigger end. But on what sort of judgment basis do we say it's good or bad? Is 250 good? And actually,
well, surely on the judgment basis, as Patrick's just laid out, that if you cannot sell the birds on, then we, the shooting community, do not like that.
That is absolutely right. But the glut of birds isn't necessarily caused. It could be, but it isn't necessarily caused by a few shoots putting down too many or shooting too many. It's caused by the accumulation of the number of birds. So if you have a great many more shoots, all putting down a modest number of birds, you could still get the glut. And there are far more shoots than there were 30, 40 years ago.
Right, I think we're going to make this a kind of central theme of what we're talking about. I'm going to throw this over to the audience in a minute, but so Jim, I know you've got opinions. Have you got some facts at your fingertips from the GWCT about big bag days?
Well, yes, and I think this is hugely important because the whole debate about bags should not just be about what we do with the game, vitally important as it is, but about the sustainability, Simon's word, in terms of our environment, and that's where we do have some facts. We, the GWCT, have recently completed some studies. They're not yet published, soon will be, so you'll get more information than I'm about to give you. But these were of a number of shoots on Exmoor, up to about 500 birds, nothing much more than that, but that's not really wholly relevant. And we studied what we might call the net beneficial environmental gain, because I feel, this is me personally, passionately, that every shoot should actually be good for the environment. In other words, all the other benefits which I'm about to describe outweigh any disbenefits.
Do you have a way of saying?
Let me finish, because what we've shown on Exmoor, by comparing areas of land which are shot over in the way I've described with similar areas that are not run as shoots, we've shown quite clearly that obviously there are some disbenefits. Within release pens, it's not too brilliant, no big surprise there, but that outside release pens, particularly in conifer woods, there's a huge net gain in biodiversity because the woods are more opened up for shooting. There's more ground cover in the woods, and we find on shooting areas there's a tendency to many more hedgerows. The number of songbirds is much higher, particularly near the large areas of cover crops, because of course cover crops begin to move away from monoculture, the traditional modern arable farming, and so we have shown, these studies will show when you see them, that there is a clear net benefit from running a shoot on a piece of land as compared to just farming it without a shoot. The worry I have, and coming back to Mark's point, is that it's not just the numbers of birds being put down on one piece of ground, but that if farming is going to really be squeezed under Brexit, which it is, there may well be a tendency for a lot more farmers to try to make commercial shoots on their ground just to generate income. Now, if they do it in the way I've just described, following our advice and the code of shooting practice, then that could be very good for the environment, and if the environmental schemes the government brings in are helpful and ones that farmers can readily adopt, then that will be good. But it will add to the numbers of game on the market.
Okay, but the intensive monoculture of birds, where you've got birds dead on the road around the shoot, and you can see hundreds and hundreds on the banks at the beginning of the season, is a shoot like that still suitably diverse under your judgment?
Well, we're looking at what's actually happening on the ground. I'm not saying to you, and I wouldn't dream of doing so either from GWCT or from a personal perspective, that every shoot produces a net gain.
Is it the big bag shoots that are a problem?
No, it's not a matter of big bags, because I've just talked about these shoots on Exmoor. One particular shoot I was thinking of, they're shooting over 9,000 acres. Well, you can put huge numbers of birds on an area of that. You don't have to shoot the same drives very often. they can do that. But equally, I can take you to a shoot on 150 acres, shooting 30 birds, which are really bad for the environment. I don't think simply the number of birds is a guide. It is the ability of that petite piece of land, that landscape, to accommodate the birds, and that relates to the trees, the woods, the hedgerows, how much cover crops, all those come into it. Simon used the word, there is no magic number. He's absolutely right. It's the right number for that particular piece of ground. I don't want to see dead birds lying around because they're all run over because the poults are over the road. That's bad management. It's not necessary.
Bad motoring as well.
Yeah.
Both. Patrick, it seems like the world is against you on this one and against the readers of Shooting Times.
I think that you use the word monoculture, and what has to be done for big bags to be achieved, and often it is creating a monoculture. That is the case. You shake your head.
We are going to have to give them a moment, but go on, make your point.
Yeah, well, I think. Going back to it, there's a greed that has crept into shooting, and we try and go bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to make more money and make more money and make more money, and that is an ugly thing, and that's not something that I think we should support.
Is that what the readers don't like? Is it the greed? Is it the kind of one of the seven deadly sins?
I think what my
or the
readers
monoculture?
want to see is for shooting to be something that their grandchildren can do, and I think if we carry on supporting big bags and people get bigger and bigger and bigger and want to put on more days and more days, and they have to create a monoculture for that to happen, then shooting will not be around for our grandchildren to enjoy.
Well, let's give it to Simon, who seems to be part of the middle way group at the moment. You've got a roses over the door view of the world from Patrick, and you've got to square that with Mark's view of the managed environment. Can you do that?
Well, we'll have a go. The problem, as I see it, is this. I mean, in parliamentary terms, and what we're trying to do in defending and promoting shooting in Parliament, wider public, all of those decision-making areas, is to get the arguments right. Now, unquestionably, and I remember when I was at the Country Alliance, we did a load of research into the argument which works the best, whichever audience you're talking to, urban, rural, rich, poor, north, south, whatever dynamic you look at, is about the consumption of game. That levels every playing field there is. People love that argument.
People really care about it.
They really care about it in extraordinarily large numbers. The second most important argument is actually economic benefit, to come back to it. And the third most important argument, so very close, is ecological uplift as well. But on the economic side, shooting's got a fantastic success story. More and more people are doing it. Lots of young people enter into it. I think it's not for us in Parliament to start telling landowners that they should be scaling down their businesses. It probably costs as much to put on a 200 bird day as it does a 400 bird day, to be honest with you. And I'm sorry, I absolutely dismiss, with the greatest respect, Patrick's view on what constitutes public concern. We need to be really careful that we don't create public concern where no public concern exists. And I'll give you one example. During the passage of the hunting bill all those years ago, a number of people used to come to me and say, of course, what we need to do is, dump stag hunting or dump coursing or dump terrier work or whatever it was, because that way the problem will go away. And as Churchill once said, an appeaser is somebody who feeds a crocodile on the basis it'll eat him last. It doesn't work. And as we saw with legislation around hunting, actually it came back to haunt us in a big way.
So are you worried that beating ourselves up here, I mean, it is very characteristic of the shooting community to worry about this a great deal when nobody else worries about it. Nobody else seems to care about big bad. Is that going to have an effect on Parliament? Are they going to legislate against shooting because we're talking about it?
I think there is a real danger that we create a narrative around this where we don't need to. There are lots of important arguments to have around shooting, but I only ever hear this being discussed in one audience, and that's normally around a table during or after a good day's shooting. And we have to be so careful about it. I mean, to most of the people I deal with, whether you shoot 500 pigeons or 500 pheasants is a completely irrelevant distinction. And I can tell you, we are dangerously close to actually tilting at the wrong windmill, and we will only have ourselves to blame. And that will kill shooting far quicker than the fears that Patrick has.
All right, Patrick, do you want to pick that point up specifically?
People, I think, often make that case that that they don't care about how many birds they're shooting. I did a little Google the other day, and you can find countless articles. The Guardian mentioned, whether it's right or not, that 100,000 birds are often being shot a day during the season.
That's the media, though. That's not
so,
real
but you're
life.
saying they're not talking about it, and only people who shoot are talking about it. But the media are talking about it, and they're talking about it because the public care about it. And I also worry about. I think we should be proactive rather than reactive, and I think we should get our house in order before people start talking about 500 birds being shot a day, rather than wait till it happens and hope that it doesn't.
Yep. Patrick, Mark.
Patrick, who decides what is acceptable and what is unacceptable? So, firstly, the idea that we would have any sensible debate mentioning the Guardian when it comes to field sports, country sports, is ridiculous.
It's a very fine newspaper, Mark.
Second, no. It's a reflection in a tiny, extraordinary loss-making enterprise. It is absolutely. If you were talking about the Sun, the Mirror, I would be quite happy. The Guardian is an intellectual, minuscule newspaper, so please don't worry about that. We will never appease it anyway.
You mean as far as the shooting community is concerned? I mean, so given this is an internal argument, but it is going to spill over. So Patrick does have a point that the liberal establishment is talking about what we're talking about.
But go back to what Simon said. The liberal establishment would still be on our backs if we shot 30, 50, 100, 150. That is true, Patrick.
Right, let's leave that one. But Mark, I want you to just pick up one of Patrick's themes, which is greed. Now, I remember, and I can't remember what the numbers are, but I remember you giving me some numbers about what happens when you have a bumper grouse here and what happens when you don't have it. Can you remember the figures you quoted to me? It was a long time ago. You talked about the number of days you let, grouse days you let, and when you have a lot of grouse on the ground. And the point was it really made no difference at all whether they were shooting a lot of grouse or a very few grouse.
Yeah, I think Patrick's point about greed is a perfectly good point. I think it has much more merit than what else he said. And there is a difficulty because, as Simon said, the economics, if you run shoot on a farm, and Jim said exactly the case of what's going to happen post-Brexit, but it wouldn't probably matter whether it was Brexit or not in terms of agricultural income. We in the countryside have been looking to diversify and to gain additional income. And that's a perfectly normal thing to do in any business occupation. The economics of running a 200 bird day and a 400 bird day, the fixed costs are exactly the same to 9 guns. You've got exactly the same fixed costs. You probably don't increase your beaters or anything else. Therefore, the revenue is greater. Therefore, it is marginally, economically, the margin is better. Have we probably pursued growth without necessary thought? In certain cases, the answer is yes. And there are certainly, whether they're big or small, and I think there's a very good argument, going back to what Jim's talking about on Exmoor, there's a very interesting argument that actually the shoot that used to put down 500 and now puts down 1,500 is probably proportionately damaging depending on its environmental and its constraints as a shoot that's on a much bigger acreage that is increased by the same percentage.
As someone who's involved in management on a day-to-day basis, is there a way of judging this and saying, right, that shoot is doing well, that shoot is doing badly, and in a way that makes commercial sense as well? Well,
if you go back, the deputy director of the GWCT, or the Game Conservancy, which I think was Stephen Tapper many years ago, wrote a book, A Question of Balance. It is a book that very few of us in the shooting community have read, and it was a very sensible book. And if you go and, if management of land, and hence shooting form part of it, is a long-term, you have to look at what the activities you're doing, what they're doing adversely and beneficially. And if you look at it, you'll shoot on that basis, and you look at it for your children or grandchildren, whether they're owners, the tenants, or whether they're whatever they may be, you will have a much better perspective. Exactly the same for farming. We know that there are certain types of farming that are not sustainable, and we shouldn't be doing it. We've learnt that. We did them. We've learnt it. And the same with shooting.
We have a new competitor now. I'm going to ask Sir Jim this question. I mean, I read a book from the 1860s. We've been arguing about this for 150 years, this specific big bad question. But we have a new component, and that's social media. And it is now possible for people, ramblers, for people to take photographs of things they don't like, which they find on shoots. Jim, is that something that the perceived poor management of wildlife on shoots that could possibly bring down shooting, and that has to be an element of perhaps the greed that Patrick's talking about?
Well, I think you need to go back slightly to the area Simon's been talking about, which is the political arena. There are always going to be a proportion of the electorate, society, whatever group, however you want to describe it, who will oppose shooting, whether it's one bird or 1,000 birds, full stop. You will never win an argument against them if you want to keep shooting. So you discount them. You've got to look at the reasonable middle ground of the electorate who, to a degree, are open to argument. And that means that we have to be able to always argue that what we are doing, aside of the emotional issue of whether it's right or wrong to shoot something for pleasure, put that argument out to say, but if you can then stand up and say, what we are doing is good for the countryside overall. Yes, it's tough on the pheasant that you've hit, but overall, the countryside is better off for shooting because we look after the land. There are more songbirds. There's a bit of predator control going on where it's relevant and legal. And the songbirds, the waders in the uplands, umpteen species are benefiting. There's more hedgerows. Woodland is better managed. If you can demonstrate all that, then numbers become much more irrelevant to the debate. But if there are shoots about, and I suspect there are, we've all probably seen them, where you certainly cannot make that argument, and it may not be because of numbers, maybe just downright bad management and a lack of concern, that's when you are opening yourself up to criticism, and that's when you have a serious risk that the minority, of which they will be, will damage the interests of the vast majority who are doing the job properly. So what I want to see is every shoot in the country being able to put their hand up, doesn't matter how big or small they are, how many of the birds they're shooting or releasing, put their hand up and say, what we are doing is good for the environment in its overall, in our area, in the overall environmental benefit. If we can do that, then we've got a very sound case that we can hold up to that middle ground of people who are open to dispute, who may not overly like the idea of people shooting birds for pleasure, but that can be persuaded that maybe that's the price we have to pay for the environmental gain.
What's your litmus test when that kind of management is going to include shooting foxes and trapping vermin? You're talking about bad management and lack of concern as being one of two of the things that shoots are not being very good at the moment. So at what point do you say that we do all these management practices and they still have a positive effect on public opinion?
Well, we do it by constantly making the case, and I will do just that. I can draw your attention to this publication. We published it a fortnight ago, Working Conservationists, a whole list of descriptions in here, articles about different shoots, small and large, traditional family estates, traditional small family farms, one or two big farming businesses who are really doing the job extremely well, running commercial shoots, many of them, or family shoots, but also absolutely top of the game in terms of looking after their local environment. Yes, these are the examples others should be following.
So as our litmus test is, if you can go into a magazine, a GWCT magazine, or if you can go on Facebook and say, I have, what I'm doing is right, and you can believe that or prove it, then that's good enough.
Well, that's the case we all should be able to have. And if we're going to argue the case for shooting to be allowed to continue, whatever you're talking about, bag size or whatever else, then to me the litmus test is, can I put my hands up and say what I am doing on my land or the land I lease is of overall benefit to the environment? So those who don't like shooting, many of them be persuaded to accept that the shooting because of the overall benefit of what we're doing. The vast majority of us as shooting people, of course, will get other benefits because we enjoy our shooting. But even those who don't necessarily approve, if they can see that what is going on is in overall benefit for the lapwings, the curlew, the songbirds, all the other things, then they might be persuaded to accept.
Could I ask Mark then, you employ a lot of keepering staff, a lot of countryside managers one way or another, would they all pass this test?
The answer is I would hope that by far the majority would pass it. I think it would be very foolish to say in any walk of life you'll ever get 100% of the highest standards. We took, for instance, Rogers over there at the GWCT, we had a keeper's briefing in the north of England a couple of years ago where we were desperate to get them to be better informed about about bird species that they don't actually come across on a working basis, because we're very keen that they become better countryside ambassadors, because if they're actually able to talk in the national park about a whole lot of things that do not relate to shooting, then that is a hell of an advantage for shooting, because they're able to talk to people every single day as our ambassadors, and we need to have that. We shouldn't. There's an enormous amount about shooting that is very good. There is some that's not very good, and we should eliminate it whenever we can. But there's a whole lot of benefits, and we need to be much prouder of those benefits. And I'm sorry, Patrick, and I hate to be negative and critical, but this is a shooting magazine. You should be as proud of most of shooting as I think I am, and I suspect most of the people at the game fair are. And I don't. Sorry, just on that before I finish bashing Patrick, I really do think we've got to stop obsessing about size of bags. It is it is just an irrelevance, because there are so many more important things, and I'd hate to get into a debate which ultimately becomes legislated that 450 is good or 400 is good and 500 is bad. It cannot be like that.
Patrick, the editor of Shooting Times, is embarrassed by shooting.
I am very embarrassed by some parts of shooting and some practices that do go on within the shooting world. I think we need to stop saying we all stand together and we all support the things that our fellow shooting men and women do. We have to be able to criticise parts of our own world.
But Simon says this could lead. This is a road to perdition that could lead...
Yeah, but you know what else is a road to disaster? Is to not criticise and to not say some of the things that are happening is wrong, and just to carry on blindly arm in arm.
All right, so Simon's shaking his head.
Well, I am, because we've spent quite a lot of the last 18 months addressing this very point, particularly over the consumption of game, particularly over the regulation of...
No, but you've been providing solutions. I'm talking about having the arguments in the first place. One of the point I'm making is if Patrick, by beating up shooting over big bags, is therefore guilty of dragging shooting down, because...
Well, I might not go as far as Mark Osborne went in my criticisms of Patrick, but I would say this, because after our last little exchange, I was whispering in his ear, I was saying, but where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? The fact is, it is really easy to assume that everybody else in the UK has the same views about these risks and these dangers as we do. And the only way of actually ascertaining what the real risk is to go out there and take independent soundings, and I'm going to use a sort of Blairite expression, things like focus group, public opinion research, to find out actually where the truth lies. And where the truth lies is much closer to where Jim is than where Patrick is on this, which is there is a concern about the consumption of game. There is real warmth towards the economic benefit that shooting brings rural communities, particularly in isolated areas, and there's real warmth towards the ecological benefit, which GWCT are so good at articulating. Those are arguments which we should be deploying time and time again, but we should also, of course, I'm completely open to the fact that this is not a perfect scenario we're talking about, and there is a place, and we're a little bit behind the curve on this, there is a place for proper regulation to make sure that everything that we do is beyond reproach.
For proper government regulation?
Not government regulation, self-regulation, before you get too excited. Because Patrick is right. If we don't do that, then we will be regulated by the state. That's what I'm trying to avoid. That's exactly what I want to avoid, and that's why we need to make sure our game consumption is up to scratch, the sustainability in terms of management is up to scratch, and indeed our PR is up to scratch. But that means standing back and taking an objective look, not, as somebody else said, obsessing about issues which are, at the moment, not on the parliamentary radar at all.
Okay, my brain's trying to cope with being behind the curve of a circle we're trying to square, and one of the things I think we're looking at here is intensive management versus PR. Because surely we would have to agree that in order to produce a reasonably large number of birds, there has to be intensive management, and it's just not good PR. So I'm taking Patrick's side here, I think. But how can you make that work with the public?
Very plainly with the evidence that we have available, and Jim's mentioned the evidence Games Conservancy is coming up with, and there is the risk is that we think we can make token gestures and that will satisfy our opponents. That will not satisfy our opponents, and actually what we will do is undermine our own activity and damage our own activity in the process. We have to operate, but more so in legislation than ever before, on the basis of evidence. Where are the real dangers? Where are the real threats? What do we have to do to minimise those? Not, stick your finger in the air and see who's shouting the loudest on Twitter and making up laws as we go along. That way we will kill shooting quicker than anything else I could imagine.
Okay, well, I'm glad you've started. We've started on the part of the talk where I want to come to some sort of conclusion about what to do next, and we haven't even mentioned hen harriers yet. But I'd like to go to the audience and see if any of you have any questions. And if I could, we've got 1, 2, 3, lots of questions. And the man from the Times, I saw you. Don't take your microphone. Let's start here. Could you say your name? Could you say who you'd like the question directed to, please?
Nick Kester, British Falconers Club. Simon, you said there is concern about the consumption of game. The reality, surely, the litmus test should be, if you can't eat it or sell it at a profit, you shouldn't shoot it.
I'm not sure you necessarily have to sell it at a profit. What is key to me is it needs to find its way into the food chain, not the pet food chain, into the human food chain, either at home or abroad. That is the absolute test.
Does that answer your question, Nick?
It does. So therefore, the bag size is irrelevant. It is the consumption of it by the food chain that is the benchmark you should all take.
Well, I think there is a key connection here with bag size, which is there is this theory sometimes that the big bags are contributing to this problem. Most shoots I know where there is a reasonably substantial harvest actually are the ones who have a pretty reliable and long-standing relationship with game dealers. There are smaller establishments, some in a part of Wales that you and I are familiar with, where it is actually difficult to get a game dealer to travel any distance to pick up maybe 100, 150 birds. I'm more worried about where that game ends up than I am on some of the bigger commercial operations. And it's why I said at the beginning, big is not always bad and small is not always good when it comes to the disposal of dead game.
Nick, does that answer your question?
It does indeed. As a falconer, I eat everything I catch. So therefore, I've never shot.
It's only about one, isn't it?
And one will do, Patrick. One will do for me.
Good. Patrick, support. Right, the man from the Times, Jerome Starkey.
Hello. Thank you for declaring my interest. As a man from the Times, it's always very nice to hear The Guardian being dismissed so roundly. But I think I should say I think it risks being slightly naive. I think we might be well inside an echo chamber here. And I think it's worth pointing out that it was The Independent that started the stories about the Conservative government dismissing sentience and saying that animals can't feel pain. And it was The Independent story that led to the huge... The Independent has even fewer readers than The Guardian. Led to a huge storm about animal sentience. So all I would say is I'd caution you for dismissing The Guardian. We read what The Guardian writes. I'm sure Simon is concerned about what The Guardian writes. People do pay attention. And I'd like to come to Patrick's defence a little bit. I think he's right to say that it's right to try and criticise some of the things which he's uncomfortable with about shooting. And to come back to your point, Simon, I'd like to ask if the big bag days, the big bag shoots have sorted out their supply chain, and if presumably it's the very small bag shoots where actually the guns take a brace, the beaters take a brace, and the landowners take a few birds, and they're all consumed immediately. Is the problem then actually the rest of the market, the middle bag days, where they're not getting the birds into the food chain, those 250 to 300 bird days that you were talking about?
Can we give that to Mark to answer, please?
Sorry, I must declare a slight interest here. We a whole group of sporting agents 2 years ago got together, and the end result of that is the BGA, and we could see that there was a real problem, the disconnect with the quantity of birds being shot and the quantity of game in the human food chain, and realised the importance of meeting the two. And the BGA is a result of that. The problem with game is it hasn't changed in terms of the industry, unlike any other part of the human food chain has changed. So if you imagine, you look at the growth of the supermarkets, it has transformed the whole supply chain of every single food, from Warburton's bread to beef burgers. Everything has changed. So your shoot that shoots 150, the problem is the infrastructure that was there going back 30 or 40 years ago, massive regional game dealers, lots of them operating out of farm buildings. We then had, you could blame Europe, you could blame all sorts of things. The majority of those closed. And the problem is there's no replacement. So the 150 or the 100 bird shoot, where do you, and you've got a low value product, how do you get it economically into the food chain? So that's the fundamental. It's nothing to do with bag size. It's actually all about a transformation of how food has been marketed, sold and produced in the UK.
Okay, so the BGA is the British Game Alliance, and we'll be speaking to him tomorrow in the Jonas Game Fair Theatre. Is the BGA this great game changer then? Can it transform the supply chain for game?
Well, we've got to transform, because our political masters are saying, and we're very lucky to have got Simon there, and they're all telling us that we have got, if game shooting's got a long-term future, we have got to get all our game into the human food chain, and that's got to be our number one priority for shooting. So that is the thing we've got to do. I mean, if you look at it now, there are essentially less than 6 big game dealers in the UK now. One of the biggest in the north, has been taken over by the man who sells duck. He's the biggest duck producer in the UK, and he sells duck into almost every single supermarket. That in itself, surprisingly, is a massive game changer, because for the first time we've actually got a game processor and wholesaler who actually understands and is financed sufficiently to be able to get game in all forms and in all different ways in processing into the supermarkets. That's what we've lost. Sorry, that's what we've not had, because it is no good selling a whole carcass bird. People don't want to buy it. The world has moved on, and unfortunately, we haven't moved on with it.
Simon, you want to say something?
Only a very, very quick response to Jerome Starkey's comment about the Independent. Of course, the Independent story about animal sentience was subsequently revealed to have actually been, to coin a phrase, fake news. It was actually wrong. But where you are right is, I think that the Guardian audience is an important one, actually. It may not have a big worldwide audience, but half the legislators in Parliament read the Guardian. So, Patrick and I are on the same page as far as that's concerned. That is important.
Okay, but not before it managed to put the Conservative Party into a flat spin over sentience. Is that not true?
We've got lots of reasons for being a flat spin. Sentience is just one of them.
Jerome, are you happy that the middle-sized shoot is going to be able to put its game through?
Charlie, you're putting me on the spot slightly. It's not for me to be happy. I think you're absolutely right to say that the concern is getting the game meat into the food chain. It does strike me that it's slightly tail wagging the dog. The shooting industry is trying to get the meat into the food chain, not because we need to feed people, although Ian Botham's efforts seem noble in that regard, but they're trying to get food into the food chain in order to justify the shooting for pleasure, which as Sir Jim mentions, is a different debate. But it is slightly back to front.
You have a problem with shooting for pleasure?
I don't have a problem with shooting for pleasure.
Good to hear that from the Times. Keith.
Hi, Keith Cowieson, Director of the independent charity Songbird Survival. Since we have 2 eminent parliamentarians on the stage here, or one former parliamentarian and minister, I just wonder what appetite, to coin a phrase, is there in the public sector for perhaps utilising this current overproduction, and I should say someone who understands the sector as well. I mean, why can't we feed this sort of stuff into prisons, the armed forces, schools, hospitals, Meals on Wheels equivalent, whatever we call it nowadays, so on and so forth, along the lines of as Jerome mentioned, Ian Botham's super initiative, and things like the Country Food Trust, where surplus game is taken and fed in charitably to the homeless and people like that. I mean, is there some way that the sector could utilise this, and that the parliamentarians could put the screw on the public sector and say, if you want your civil service canteens to be slightly subsidised, have some of this wonderful, wholesome food to feed into that? That's good.
I think, is this one working now? Yes, no, yes? Make your minds up. Half of you shaking your heads and half of them nodding. I assume it is working. Lovely idea, but much as I'd like to think we could do that sort of thing, I think we have to accept this is not cheap meat. I know, the fact that the game dealers get it for 20 pence or for nothing, or even in some cases you have to pay them to take away, would imply that it's cheap. But by the time you've processed it, and thrown away what is inedible and half the carcass, etc., and paid for the disposal of that. Don't forget all that stuff. You're not necessarily ending up with a very cheap, very high quality. And I think I wanted to pick this up in answer to Jerome, because I don't think it's entirely just a question of encouraging people to eat meat to justify us shooting it. It is actually very, very high quality, low cholesterol, high protein, very good quality meat, and we should encourage people to eat it.
Well, shouldn't you start?
But it's not going to be right at the bottom of the price chain.
No, the British Game Alliance is saying we should be subsidising this. And the old idea of up goes a sovereign, bang goes £0.50 and down comes sixpence. I mean, if we paid that extra sixpence on our £37.50 plus VAT per bird, then surely we'd be able to subsidise grouse for Her Majesty's prisoners.
Well, if the BGA can justify and get the price down low enough, of course I'd support it.
Simon,
but I'm not a man for subsidy. Basically I don't agree in subsidy. And I'd far rather the value of the meat from all our game, whether it's and we've got to include venison and everything else in this. If the value of it, the true food value of it, was reflected in the price, we wouldn't have a problem. We do have a perception problem, and that's good. Nobody's mentioned that. That's got to be overcome. But we need to make sure that the food, the value, the true nutritional value and quality, it's free range. God help us. What we pay for free range chicken or anything else it's very good stuff, and that's how it should be reflected in the market.
Just to add to that, and the BGA objective, I know, is not just a UK market, which perhaps we've traditionally relied on to some extent. It's looking at markets in Hong Kong and Singapore and Central America and other places which have currently been out of range. But it's also looking at different ways of presenting the final product. I think at the moment our mindset is the complete bird. For sort of roasting purposes, we're not really looking at sausages, pies, curries, all the other sort of ways in which we can creatively use game meat in perhaps a cheaper way.
Well, we have been having this argument for a while.
A bit more accessible to a wider customer base.
I mean, sausages are the answer, and we've been saying that ever since I've been working in this world.
We have, and I think that slightly highlights a problem in a way. I think we've been talking about this for a very long time and haven't actually. Everybody's always thought, yeah, it's a really good idea as long as somebody else does it. Well, the wagons are now circling, and I think we've got to a stage where we can't carry on talking about it and not doing anything anymore. And I think we were all woken up 2 years ago in Parliament when there was the first time that shooting has ever been debated in hostile circumstances, which was about the potential abolition of driven grouse shooting. And it woke everybody up to the fact that there are people out there who want to get us. And one way we can avoid them getting us is if we get our game marketing right. And that means doing it. It doesn't mean talking about it.
Jerome?
Just to pick up on Jim's point about free-range birds, which they are, and pheasants could be marketed as very wild, artisanal, healthy food, and the BJ is going to do that. but a lot of them are reared in conditions which have been banned for chickens in the raised cages. So I just wanted to ask whether you are comfortable with that side of the food chain, because if you are going to get them into the food chain, it's the whole process which the consumers are going to want to know about.
I'll take that, because I have to put my hand up in some ways as responsible, because if you go back, and it is a while now, I know, to the 2010 general election, the previous government, the Labour government, had commenced the process to ban the keeping of laying pheasants in raised cages. And I decided one of the first things I did as minister was to, after that election, was to halt that process of banning it. On one reason, and one reason alone: there was no scientific evidence. I do strongly believe in science as a reason for, or lack of reason for, making political judgments. I know that politics is not just about science. I'm not that naive. But I do believe that wherever possible, particularly on welfare issues, it should be based on science. And at that stage, there was no science. We set up a working group to look at the science, and to be quite honest, I've lost touch with what's happened to it. My honest personal view is I don't like it. I agree with you, it looks bad, and I wouldn't like to see it happen. It's not actually true to say that it's not allowed in poultry, because most poultry is raised on slats or wire floors or whatever. Most laying poultry, I should say, as opposed to table poultry. So it's not that it's worse conditions, but it's the same. But I agree with you in principle. I don't like it, but I do think we should base these things on science. Are pheasants worse off on raised floors than if they were on in big laying pens?
You were arguing for public opinion earlier on. I mean, if you were in the same job today, would you have made the same decision?
Yes, I would, because, well, I don't know, because I'm out of touch with what's happened on the scientific studies that I set up. They hadn't completed when I left office, and so I don't know, genuinely don't know what's happened since. It was nothing to do with GWCT, I hasten to add. Assuming there is no... I think by now I'd be saying, where the hell is the science? You know, you've had, whatever it is, 8 years now to prove it one way or the other, and I therefore might make a judgment based on arguable prejudice at this stage. If there was no science, I'd say, but I would want to know what the science was. At that stage, though, they were proposing to make a decision without any science and without even looking for any science, and that is what I didn't like.
Okay, thank you. Oh, look.
Just Jim did a report. The science was very positive in terms of using the raised laying units. Welfare was found to be better up to 12 weeks, keeping hens in a raised laying unit than on the floor.
Tim Bonner, Countryside Alliance. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. He says it's fine. Simon, when you sweep to power, will you ban those cages?
No, for the same reason Jim says. I think that, and Tim reinforcing the more up to date account of the science, and that needs it. In any welfare-related dispute in Parliament, and they seem to happen at relentless regularity these days. There is a lot of emotion. There's a lot of activity on social media, and there is a distinct lack of available science. And when that happens, invariably, the law that is produced is inadequate. So we have to stand back, put a sort of towel over our head, and just base our decisions on science, and not listen to the white noise, which is a sort of constant backdrop these days.
Okay, but Patrick, you probably would ban raised cages, would you?
I have to be honest, my knowledge of the science behind raised cages is not really good enough to have a formed opinion on it, so I'm going to abstain for fear of being hated even more.
We'll give you a little applause at the end. Mark, does it worry you that we're always talking about the science, that the economics don't seem to come into this at all? Because you need cages, don't you?
The economics is very important to shooting to a section of the countryside. Is it the most important thing? It clearly is to certain parts of the shooting industry. and we shouldn't. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it wrong. But if you've got farms or estates where shooting is a major contributor to their economics, therefore they're going to look at shooting in a different way to if you were individuals or groups of individuals who do not take account of the economic circumstances of shooting. So it's a very broad church, and what we're trying to do is to have a scenario that is actually covers everybody. And I do think it's really important. I mean, if you look at the BGA, for instance, were we late in doing it? Yes. The increase in the number of birds ready for the table and the demand the gap got progressively wider, and we didn't react within the shooting industry anything like quick enough.
Christopher Graffius, BASC.
Two things. Perhaps the most important piece of work that the GWCT has done for the Code of Good Shooting Practice was establishing the formula for the stocking density of pens on shoots. And that is a key piece of work. And so long as that is followed, I think shoots are in the right territory. I would also say that in every human activity, you will get excess and gross overconsumption. And I'm sure no one on the panel is defending that.
Good, Mark, an image problem.
Obviously. Just on there's an interesting thing on welfare, which is that size doesn't have a correlation to good or bad welfare. It may have, on Christopher's point, on PR. But it actually, if you go and look at it, when I start, I'm 65 years old, I started rearing birds myself when I was at school. The idea that my welfare of rearing birds at school in Norfolk was actually anything like as good when I was rearing 200. There was 100 pheasants and 100 duck to sell, because that's how I tried to make money, was anything like as good as someone rearing, 500,000 who has a full-time vet is ridiculous. So we've just got to, now that may be my 200 was much more politically acceptable in a PR terms, but it doesn't mean that my welfare was anything like as good as a much bigger operation.
Okay, thank you. We've got one more question.
Hi, Roderick Ensring from the European Federation for Hunting and Conservation. This is more a question for the politicians. We talked about the game market. I would like to know, what is your opinion on the consequences of Brexit for the game market, as a large proportion of the game actually crosses the water to the continent where I'm from?
He brings that up now. Simon,
no, I thought I got to the
you
end
have
of,
got 1 minute.
I got to the end of a meeting.
And 30 seconds. That's it.
I think there are a lot of unknown consequences. I should have raised this with a former colleague of Jim's the other day, George Eustace, who's the minister responsible for this, and he said, we don't know. He said, because we're not even going to start talking about that element of element of trade arrangements until after March of next year and the transition period. I think there's an issue potentially, funnily enough, around lead and exporting dead game containing lead. That may be something which is going to be quite complicated and quite difficult for a lot of people at this event to get used to. Who knows what will happen there. There is some talk about what the tariff arrangement might or might not be. And there is, I think, a perfectly justifiable recognition that whatever happens, if we're going to export dead game to the continent, it will need to be reared to precisely the same standards after Brexit as it was prior Brexit. Anybody who thinks it's all going to be a free-for-all in a post-Brexit world in terms of standards, I think they will be in for a nasty shock.
Right, I'm not going to let you. Sorry, Jim. We're going to move on. We did cover quite a lot of Brexit yesterday. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions, but I just want to give everybody on the panel a very quick opportunity to sum up. It seems to me it's on the one hand you have PR, on the one hand you have science, and somehow shooting's caught in the middle. Jim, what can we possibly do to improve both for shooting?
Well, we have to constantly up our game, is the bottom line. I don't think we should be ignorant of an element of public opinion. As I said earlier, we'll never satisfy all of them. Some will always oppose us full stop. But I believe there are a lot of people who are prepared to take a broader view. I agree with Patrick that we should be prepared to do everything we can to get rid of bad practice. I genuinely think the BGA may well help in that. I'd be interested to hear Mark's observation on the issue of that he referred to, and he quite rightly, I'm sure, said he cannot guarantee that all his shoots are of the high standard I suggested earlier. But the outcome of that would be that the BGA would withdraw a shoot assurance from anybody who wasn't up to those standards.
Is anybody here happy to not shoot at a shoot that doesn't have BGA assurance? If so, you're going to go shooting and you see it doesn't have BGA assurance, and therefore you go, well, I won't shoot there. Is anybody here convinced by that? One. You would shoot at a non-BGA shoot. Is anybody against Christopher on this one? The BGA doesn't seem to have it yet.
Well, I'll hand over to Mark. The other thing I do just want to say, and I think it's hugely important, although I am here with GWCT, we published yesterday this book, The Knowledge. And if everybody who goes shooting, and again, Mark referred to this, talking about his clients becoming ambassadors for shooting, if everybody who goes shooting reads this, dips into it, they will put it in the loo and read it when they're in there, whatever, there is some tremendous information in there to help people actually understand the world in which they are operating, the environment, what things mean, it's not heavy science, it's just useful information for anybody who's shooting.
It's $15.95 and it's on the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust stand. Mark, they don't love the BGA.
Sorry, just final point. If we can get game into supermarkets in a way that people will consume, they see it and every so often they'll buy it, the advantage that has in terms of the PR for shooting is phenomenal. If we can just get it so that it is like products, foods that we would have thought were incredibly rare 30, 40 years ago, if we can get game in so that every so often many more people buy game, then shooting has a much better future than now.
Let's give last word to Patrick. 2 microphones, Patrick.
I think there was a great PR mistake made here, which was Mark Osborne, who I like very much, dismissing Guardian readers on the basis of their intelligence.
You're going back in time.
I know Guardian readers who shoot, and I would like to live in a world where more Guardian readers started shooting. And frankly, if we sit here at the game fair and dismiss them as idiots, as was done, we are fools. We are the idiots.
All right, but okay, one final question for you. Are we beating ourselves up too much? Should we be holding this debate at all?
Yeah, I think it's very important, as I say, to criticise some of the practices that go on within shooting, and if we can't do that, then we're really on the road to ruin.
Has anybody listening today changed their mind on this subject, either one way or the other? Or are you all confirmed in your one person? Nick, 2 people, thank you. Good. Well, we've moved, as with the Western Front, 300 yards forward and 200 yards back. Thank you very much indeed to my panel, to Jim Paice, Mark Osborne, Patrick Galbraith and Simon Hart MP. I think you've achieved as much as we possibly could. And we're back in a minute with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust again. So thank you to them.